Consider this scenario. You are 6 months pregnant and still caring for 23 kids. For the longest time, royal women have been faced with this situation. For hundreds of years, royal women weren't just expected to produce offspring, but were also used as baby-producing machines from an endless cycle of pregnancies and deaths. They were measured in value based on the number of births they produced. These women were generally engaged by their early teenage years and went through a lifetime of immense suffering with the following cycles: conceive, have a baby, give the baby to a wet nurse and recover, and then repeat. These women did not dread menopause. Instead, they anticipated it because this meant they would be free from constant pregnancies. In this episode, we will take a look at the top 8 queens in history who had the largest number of children. In 1593, Mumtaz Mahal was born into a Persian noble family and married the future emperor of India, Shah Jahan, at the age of 19. While Shah Jahan took 2 wives to meet his political obligations and had 1 child by each of them due to duty, Mumtaz was the only wife he ever loved. Shah Jahan believed that Mumtaz was the most beautiful and virtuous woman on earth. Not only was she his wife, she was also his most trusted advisor, accompanying him on all of his journeys, including military expeditions. He treated her like a queen and gave her a level of wealth and support that had never been seen before in a Mughal empress. Together, Mumtaz and Shah Jahan had 14 children, but only 7 would survive into adulthood. Among these 7 children were their daughter Jahanara Boom, who was very influential, and their son Aurangzeb, who would later become the Mughal emperor. Mumtaz's final childbirth was a tragedy, as she died after 30 hours of difficult labor giving birth to her last child, Gohar. Shah Jahan was devastated and honored Mumtaz by constructing the magnificent Taj Mahal for her tomb. He himself was buried beside her 27 years later. After Shah Jahan's death, there was a brutal civil war among his 4 remaining sons, with Aurangzeb ultimately emerging as the new, ruthless Mughal emperor. Queen Charlotte was born into royalty in 1744 and is known to be the first queen of Great Britain known to be descended from Africa through 13 generations. In 1761, at age 17, she married King George III. The couple were very happy together and much preferred their time spent being a family, raising their children, rather than attending royal gatherings. Within a year of their wedding, Queen Charlotte had already given birth to the future King George IV. During the next 21 years of their marriage, she gave birth to 15 more children altogether. Charlotte's surviving children were George IV, Frederick, William IV, Charlotte, Queen of Warenberg, Edward, father of Queen Victoria, Augusta, Elizabeth, Ernest, Augustus, King of Hanover, Adolphus, Mary, Sophia, Octavius, Alfred, and Amelia. Queen Charlotte absolutely loathed being constantly pregnant, and while expecting her 14th child, she said, "No one wished for freedom from their prison as much as I desire to be free from this burden. I wish I could know for certain that this was my last." Although Charlotte did not enjoy being pregnant, she loved her children dearly, as did they love her. However, her 2 youngest children, Alfred, 2 years old, and Octavius, 4 years old, died of smallpox. It is remarkable that all of Queen Charlotte's children lived to adulthood during the 1700s. Charlotte protected her daughters from what she experienced, and as parents do, they also lay out the timeline for them to marry. However, some didn't marry at all, and the rest waited until they were in their 40s to marry, so they wouldn't be having babies every year. Instead, focused on their education, and she kept them close by. Sadly, she didn't have any live grandchildren from her daughters. King George III became mentally ill in his last years and left their firstborn son to take over his duties as Prince Regent. At 74 years old, Charlotte died surrounded by many of her children. In 1275, the Spanish princess, named for her well-known great-great-grandmother, Elena of Aquitaine, married a future king of England, Edward I, when he was just 15 years old and she was only 13 years old. As an intense soldier, Edward conquered Wales and fought against Scotland. However, during his personal time, he was a very loving and loyal husband to Elena. Elena also showed her toughness by traveling with Edward during times of warfare and regular military expeditions, whilst having to give birth to 16 children. Her first newborn, who was born on the 13th day of her life, died shortly after birth. Both of her next two children, Catherine and Joan, passed away shortly after the time of their births. This was very typical during the years of youthful mothers pregnant during years that their physical growth was not fully developed. John and Henry were the only two children that lived to be 10 years of age. Elena was the first child to reach adulthood. While in the crusade beside King Edward, Elena went into labor and gave birth to a baby girl that did not have a heartbeat. At this point, Elena was completely fatigued from her physical effort. A further misfortune occurred when her 3-year-old son, James, passed away from smallpox. After 3 of her children had passed away, Elena had to go through another pregnancy to give birth to another son, Henry, who became the ill-fated King Edward II. In 1307, while participating alongside her husband in northern England, Elena was struck with malaria, which her frail body was unable to contend with, and died at the age of 48, surrounded by her children, being given a final farewell. King Edward was devastated by the death of his sister, and consequently ordered the construction of 12 magnificent stone crosses along the route of her final procession from Lincoln to London. Elena gave birth to a total of 16 living children, including her daughter Karen, nicknamed Anna, who was born to a Turkish prince and married King Leo II of Armenia shortly before 1262. Contemporary reports speak highly of her lovely spirit, beauty, and loyalty as an excellent support for her spouse in good times and bad. In total, she bore an astounding 16 children. 10 were single births, and 3 sets were twins. The first was unnamed, and the second and third were both premature and died without surviving after birth. The premature sons named Constantine and Phemi. The fourth, Hethum II, went on to govern Armenia before being murdered. Isabella was next in line. After her came Tauros III, who took over as king after his brother was murdered and died by murder himself. The last child of Queen Kiran, the last twins, are Ashen, the youngest brother and king, murdered after he was king, and Aelin. After all those births, Queen Kiran was exhausted and chose to be a nun, entering a monastery until she died in 1285. In 1717, Maria Teresa was born and became Holy Roman Empress. She married 19-year-old Francis Stephen, who was a Duke of Lorraine, and they soon fell in love. Tragically, he was unfaithful to her throughout their entire marriage. At that time, women were forbidden to rule important parts of the empire. To circumvent this, she made Francis her co-emperor, but excluded him from participating in any important decisions that she made. In effect, she had power and provisions over her empire. She also helped reform the empire by getting laws and policies approved while at the same time protecting it from threats. During her reign, she had 16 children born to her in just 19 years. She stated that had she not been pregnant the entire time, she would have led her troops herself into battle. Maria Teresa and her 13 remaining children were the most winning political players in history, with marriage and alliances across Europe. Unfortunately, smallpox plagued her family, taking the lives of her 10 children. Maria Theresa was a strong advocate of the new, life-saving smallpox inoculation for her children. Among them were her sons, Ferdinand Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, and Maximilian Francis, Archbishop. Jealous of Francis's numerous mistresses, Maria Theresa created a chastity commission to investigate and punish prostitution, homosexuality, and adultery. In the back of her mind, she hoped to catch her husband in the act. After 29 years of marriage, Francis passed away, and in mourning, Maria Theresa wore black for the remainder of her life. Eventually suffering from smallpox herself, she ultimately died at 63 years old. Maria Carolina had an astounding ability to give birth, just like her mother, Maria Theresa. Maria Carolina had a very close relationship with her younger sister, Marie Antoinette, who became Queen of France. Maria Caroline's mother had previously arranged for 3 of her sisters to marry King Ferdinand of Naples and Sicily. However, all 3 tragically died from smallpox. Maria Carolina, as the next candidate, was very frightened and wept, asking her mother not to send her because she believed the marriage was cursed. Ignoring her pleas, at the age of 15, Maria Carolina was taken to Italy. The moment she arrived, she felt hatred towards him. He was very ugly and came off in a very vulgar manner about their wedding night. Although she felt disgust, Maria Carolina knew it was her duty to fulfill her obligations to her husband's family. Maria Carolina had 17 children, but only 7 reached adult life. As Ferdinand was a weak king, Maria Carolina took the opportunity and ruled more or less as her mother had done before, by arranging political marriages for the remaining children across Europe. When Napoleon invaded her homeland, she and her family fled to Austria to seek his help through her nephew, Emperor Francis I. Following Napoleon's defeat, before Ferdinand could reclaim his crowns, the overwhelmed Queen Maria Carolina was found dead on the floor surrounded by her papers, having suffered a stroke at the age of 62. She never witnessed the defeat of Napoleon or the return of her husband. Anne was born in 1665, the daughter of James II, future King of England, and married the future Prince George of Denmark at 18. Their lives were fraught with heartache after losing their first child due to stillbirth, followed by 2 daughters, Mary and Anne Sophia, at nearly 2 and 1 years when they contracted smallpox. Subsequently, Anne had a miscarriage, and both daughters died. The couple sat in silence, holding hands, often grieving. For over 16 years, Anne had 18 pregnancies, in which she lost each child to either miscarriage, stillbirth, or early death. Only a few of them lived long enough to be given a name. Her 7th child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived the longest. He was Anne's favorite son and the hope of the whole Stuart dynasty. He died at 11 years old of an unknown illness. Her 8th child, Mary, and 9th child, George, were born alive and baptized. However, both of them died several hours after birth. Anne's 15th pregnancy resulted in miscarried twins that were not identified due to the early stage of pregnancy. Now doctors believe Anne had a condition known as Hughes syndrome, or sticky blood, and this made it nearly impossible for blood to flow through the small veins of the fetus. The loss of her children could possibly have been avoided if Anne had been given a simple aspirin. It is an absolutely devastating thought. Now, the current Queen of Georgia and holder of the record for the most children is Darajan Dadani, with 23 children in total. Darajan was born in 1738 to a Georgian royal family and was married at the age of 12 to the future king Heraclius II, who was 30 years old at the time of their marriage and had recently lost his second wife. He had already fathered 4 sons prior to his marriage to Darajan. The following 3 decades after their marriage saw the birth of Darajan's 23 children and 13 surviving children to adulthood, as well as her efforts to ensure that all of her sons would inherit the throne of Georgia, rather than the sons of her deceased husband. After the death of King Heraclius, King George III of Georgia renounced the will made by his father and sought revenge against his stepmother and the remaining 5 sons she had brought forth from her union with King Heraclius. George sought support from Russia against these rivals, and the surviving sons of Darajan sought support from Iran against George. Alexander made an attempt to stage a coup against the newly named King George III, but failed in doing so. Daraja, Queen Darajan, suffered an arbitrary arrest when her son George III passed away in the year 1800. Shortly thereafter, the Russian government intervened on her behalf. Queen Darajan made a desperate appeal to Tsar Alexander I, the Emperor of Russia, asking if he could appoint one of her sons king in place of George's son, Prince David. But instead of granting her request, Tsar Alexander annexed Georgia, effectively terminating the Bagrationi dynasty after a 1,000-year rule over Georgia, and ordered Darajan and her extended family to be placed under watch in Russia. The powerful queen spent her last years living in a rented apartment in St. Petersburg until her death in 1807, about at the age of 69. The queens were mothers and warriors of ascendance who endured the extreme physical and emotional agonies that most people cannot comprehend. Their wombs were the battlefields of history. Their children were their greatest affections and their primary political assets, fought for in a ruthless and perilous Game of Thrones. Their stories illustrate the devastating burden of royal obligation and human compassion.